An 18-year-old walks into the water on the 4th of July. His friends leave the island without him. 2 days later, a park ranger finds his body on the shore. That much isn't in dispute. Almost everything else is. A sheriff's office that offered reassurance before it had evidence. A state autopsy that still hasn't been made public weeks later. A second autopsy, flown 1,000 miles away and paid for by a family who no longer trusted the first one, that came back with a word nobody wanted to hear: undetermined. And now, a forensic pathologist with no connection to this case, no connection to this family, and nothing to gain from saying it, has gone on camera to explain exactly why undetermined might be the most honest word anyone has used in this case so far. Somewhere between a boat taking on water and a body found on a barrier island, the official story stopped adding up to the people who loved Nolan Wells the most. Tonight we're going to walk through exactly why, from who he was, to what happened on that island, to the piece of forensic evidence that's still sitting in an evidence room instead of in his family's hands. This is not a story about a verdict. Nobody has been charged. No cause of death has been proven. This is a story about what happens when a family asks a simple question: what happened to our son? And, weeks later, still doesn't have an answer science is willing to stand behind. Welcome back to Black Docket. If this is your first time here, hit subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. We follow the documents, not the headlines. Let's get into it. Before any of this, Nolan Wells was just a kid from Ocean Springs, Mississippi, who happened to be really good at football. He grew up in a family of 6 kids, the oldest of 5 siblings, raised by his mother, Christine, in a Gulf Coast town of about 19,000 people. He played wide receiver at Ocean Springs High School, the kind of small-town Friday night football program where the whole community shows up under the lights, whether their own kid is on the field or not. His high school coach, Jake Bramlett, later put it simply: Nolan was the kind of son, teammate, and student every coach hopes to have. Not just talented, humble. The kind of player who worked before he talked. On National Signing Day in 2025, Wells told a local news crew it felt like a blessing to be continuing his football career alongside some of his closest friends, several of whom were signing to the same program with him, Southwest Mississippi Community College, where he enrolled to play wide receiver and study general business. That detail matters more than it might seem. The friends he signed with, the friends who called him a brother, were largely the same group of friends he was with on Horn Island on the 4th of July. The same friends who made it back to the mainland that night without him. When Nolan went missing, the response from his community wasn't confusion about who he was. It was disbelief that this had happened to him specifically. Within days, a fundraiser set up to help the family cover funeral expenses had raised more than $200,000. Ocean Springs High School and Southwest Mississippi Community College both issued statements grieving a young man they described, independently of each other, in almost identical terms: humble, respected, loved. His mother, Christine, has spoken publicly only in careful, measured moments, thanking the community for their prayers and asking, more than once, simply to be allowed to grieve in private while the investigation continues. That is the position this family has held from day one. Not outrage for its own sake. Not accusations without evidence, just a request that keeps repeating itself in every statement they've released. Tell us the truth, however long it takes. To understand why that request has become the center of a national story, you have to go back to the afternoon of July 4th, because that's where the first unanswered question begins. Horn Island sits a few miles off the Mississippi Gulf Coast, a barrier island, undeveloped, reachable only by boat. On the afternoon of July 4th, Nolan Wells traveled there with a group of friends to spend the holiday on the water, the kind of trip that Gulf Coast teenagers have made every summer for generations. At some point in the afternoon, accounts place it around 4:30 p.m., the group's boat began taking on water. A mechanical issue with the bilge pump, the system that clears water out of the hull, forced the group to make a decision. They needed to get back to the mainland, and the boat wasn't going to comfortably carry everyone. According to a statement from the family, relayed through a friend's social media post, Nolan made the decision to stay behind on the island, planning to return later with a second group. One of the friends who was there, Warren Hudson, later described the moment publicly, saying the group was in the middle of an emergency, trying to save the boat itself, and that leaving Nolan wasn't a decision made carelessly. It was, in his telling, Nolan's own choice to stay, in part because another young woman had also remained on the island. That account has not been seriously disputed by investigators. What has never been fully explained, not by the friends, not by investigators, not in any public statement to date, is what happened between the moment the group left Horn Island and the moment, roughly 40 hours later, that Nolan Wells' body was found in the water along the island's northwestern shore. No one has publicly claimed to have seen what happened to him in that window. No completed timeline of his final hours has been released. And that absence, not any specific piece of evidence, just the sheer size of the gap, is what opened the door to every question that followed. When Nolan didn't return with the rest of the group, his family did what any family would do. They called for help immediately. The search that followed lasted more than 40 hours and involved the Jackson County Sheriff's Office, the United States Coast Guard, state agencies, and eventually dozens of volunteers combing the shoreline and surrounding water. The Sheriff's Office publicly asked residents for any photos or video taken near the northwest part of Horn Island on the 4th of July, describing the investigation as active and ongoing. On the morning of Monday, July 6th, a U.S. park ranger found a body along the island's shoreline. It was Nolan Wells. For a family that had spent nearly 2 full days not knowing, the discovery answered one question and opened dozens more. And the very next thing that happened, a public statement from local officials delivered before any formal medical examination had taken place, is where this case's credibility problem actually begins. In the initial days after Nolan's body was recovered, statements from local officials described the death, in general terms, as consistent with an accidental drowning. No completed autopsy had been released. No toxicology results existed yet. The state's official autopsy, conducted by the Mississippi State Medical Examiner's Office, took place on July 7th. But its full findings still have not been made public, weeks later. Here is the piece of forensic science almost no one outside the field understands, and it's the single most important concept in this entire case. Drowning is what forensic pathologists call a diagnosis of exclusion. That means a medical examiner is never supposed to look at a body recovered from water and simply write down drowning. They have to work backward, ruling out blunt force trauma, strangulation, drug toxicity, and natural causes like a heart attack before drowning becomes the documented answer. Water conceals almost everything. A body that drowned and a body that was killed another way and later ended up in water can look, on the surface, almost identical. That process takes time. It takes a fresh, well-preserved body, complete toxicology, and full access to every part of the anatomy that might carry evidence. In this case, none of those conditions were fully met before the public was given a conclusion to sit with. The family's attorney, civil rights lawyer Benjamin Crump, said plainly in the days after the discovery that the family had not been told by investigators whether foul play was suspected, one way or the other. That silence, paired with a public tone of reassurance, is what pushed the family toward a decision most families never have to make: commissioning their own independent autopsy. An independent autopsy is not a routine request. It requires flying a body, in this case roughly 1,000 miles, to Washington, D.C., and paying, privately, for an examiner the family trusts to look at the evidence without any institutional loyalty to local law enforcement. The family retained Dr. Roger Mitchell, a board-certified forensic pathologist and president of the National Medical Association, the oldest and largest professional organization representing black physicians in the United States. The independent autopsy was performed on July 10th, 6 days after Nolan disappeared and 4 days after his body was recovered. Every one of those days matters. Decomposition does not pause for a family to arrange logistics. By the time Dr. Mitchell examined the body, it had already been through days of exposure, a first state-conducted autopsy, and cross-country transport. He was, in effect, examining a record that had already begun to fade before he ever opened his file. Weeks later, at a press conference held during the NARC's National Convention in Chicago, Crump revealed the preliminary results. The independent autopsy found the cause and manner of Nolan Wells' death to be undetermined, pending further investigation. Dr. Mitchell's report noted red discoloration in the soft tissue at the back of the head, a finding that, by his own account, could represent nothing more than normal decomposition, or could indicate blunt force injury. Without more information, there was no way to say which. Crump was careful, at that press conference, not to overstate the finding. He said explicitly that the pathologist could not rule out whether some non-accidental factor contributed to Nolan's death, but he did not claim that one had been proven either. NARC President Derek Johnson used the moment to criticize the pace and transparency of the local investigation, calling on officials to pursue the case with more urgency. What nobody claimed, on that stage, was a conclusion the evidence didn't support. That restraint, an undetermined finding, delivered without embellishment, is exactly what caught the attention of forensic pathologists watching from outside the case entirely. One of them was Dr. Judy Melinek. Dr. Judy Melinek is a board-certified forensic pathologist with no connection to Nolan Wells, his family, the state of Mississippi, or anyone involved in this investigation. She watched the same press conferences the public did, and afterward, she recorded her own breakdown of what the evidence, and the gaps in it, actually mean. Her first point cuts straight to the diagnosis of exclusion problem. Being able to state a cause of death with confidence, she explained, after a body hasn't been recovered for days and has already been autopsied twice under conditions of ongoing decomposition, is extraordinarily difficult. Identifying trauma or natural disease in a fresh body is one thing. Doing it in a decomposed one is an entirely different challenge. And in this case, both examiners were working against the clock from the moment they started.
I'm Dr. Judy Melinek. I'm a board-certified forensic pathologist. And I just watched the Nolan Wells press conference. And I wanted to share some context for everyone. Being able to definitively state the cause of death after a body has not been found for several days and has been subsequently autopsied twice with signs of decomposition is incredibly unlikely. Drowning is what's called a diagnosis of exclusion, which means that when you've got a fresh body, you want to be able to look at the body and see if there's any other causes of death for that body that is found in water that exclude the death being exclusively a drowning. So for example, if someone is shot and then thrown in the water, you'll have that gunshot and they'll be bleeding and the gunshot will be the cause of death, and the thrown in the water is not the cause of death. It's not even on the death certificate. If a person is strangled and they die from strangulation and then their dead body is thrown in the water, their body will take on water, but the cause of death is going to be strangulation, not drowning. Also for any kind of traumatic injuries. Now we got to talk about natural death for a second. If someone has a heart attack while they are swimming, and because they're having the heart attack as they're exercising in the water and they take on water and they drown, the cause of death is actually drowning, and the heart attack is listed on the death certificate under other significant conditions contributing to death. So even though the heart attack might have killed them on dry land, it might not have. Most certainly they wouldn't have drowned on dry land. So we defer to the hostile environment, which is the water, to call it a drowning. Now, identifying natural disease and identifying trauma is relatively easy in a fresh body. It can be very difficult in a decomposed body. His body was found 2 days after he disappeared, and this second autopsy done by Dr. Roger Mitchell wasn't until 4 days later. So we're dealing with quite a bit of decomposition, even if the body was refrigerated during that time. And then we have this other issue of the fact that not all the results are back. The toxicology would have been done on the fluids from the body from the first autopsy. From the second autopsy, you're going to have a lot higher alcohol levels from the decomposition caused by bacteria, not caused by drinking. So again, it's the fluid and blood from the first autopsy that really matter. And the other thing you have to consider, and there's one other important piece of information from that press conference, which is that the neck block, the portion of the neck from the front end, was missing. So Dr. Mitchell did not have a chance to examine that part of Nolan Wells' anatomy. Why is that important? Because if somebody is strangled, especially manual strangulation, the injuries are going to be to the front of the neck. There may be some redness at the back of the neck as well if, injury comes from behind, but generally this part of the neck doesn't have the major blood vessels and the airway. It's the front of the neck that does. So compression or damage to the front of the airway, that's going to be found in the neck block that is still sitting at the medical examiner's office that was not released with the body. So you may ask, is this common practice for pathologists to keep a portion of the anatomy with them at the medical examiner's office and not release it to the family? And the answer is yes. We will sometimes retain important specimens that have pathology in a jar under formaldehyde at the medical examiner's office for further examination or as evidence. And the absence of that neck block is really important because we still don't have information from the first autopsy that has not been released yet. So we don't know if it was kept out of an abundance of caution, meaning that it didn't have any findings and it was negative, or it was kept because it has findings, because there's a broken hyoid bone, or because there's hemorrhage in the strap muscles. Until we get that first autopsy report, we don't know why it's been retained. So why should anybody do a second autopsy? A second autopsy is often done in cases where there is a high-profile case such as this, or there is concern from the family for foul play, and they're just not getting answers from the medical examiner's office because the medical examiner's office is still doing their investigation and is keeping things under wraps, because if there is foul play, they have the evidence, they have the physical evidence that might be able to trap the killer, and they don't want to release that to the public. Even if there is no evidence of foul play, just the lack of evidence is evidence and is important information that might affect how people are interrogated, whether they're going to tell the truth or not the truth about what happened to him. You have to understand that the medical examiner's autopsy is legally mandated, and it is ultimately the most independent autopsy because it's not beholden to the family, it's not beholden to the prosecutor, to the police, to anybody else. It's an independent agency. So that is an independent autopsy, but it takes time. And it takes time until we get all the information back, including the toxicology report. And to answer the question, if somebody's intoxicated and they drown as a result of their intoxication, meaning that they're just, too intoxicated to be able to swim adequately, the cause of death would still be a drowning, but the intoxication would be considered a significant contributing condition. But because of what I said about alcohol forming from bacteria after death, if the body is decomposed, you have to subtract some of that alcohol because it may have been caused by bacteria and may not have been a sign of intoxication. And you can have up to 0.20 gram percent. So 0.08 is above the legal limit in most states for driving, but you can get up to 0.20 in a massively decomposed body. So it really throws you off when you have decomposition and alcohol to try to figure out whether there was alcohol on board or whether all of it's just been made by bacteria. So I hope this answers some questions about what I saw in the press conference, what other people saw as well. I will go through the autopsy, or at least the report that's been released, with a fine-tooth comb, but these are just my first impressions based on watching the press report.
Her second point is the one that's driven the most public conversation, the missing neck block. When Dr. Mitchell performed the independent autopsy, a specific section of Nolan's anatomy, the front of the neck, was not included with the rest of the body. That tissue had been retained by the state medical examiner's office and never released. Retaining tissue during an active investigation is not unusual on its own. Medical examiners do this regularly, sometimes out of caution, sometimes because there's something in that tissue worth preserving as evidence. But the region in question here is not incidental. It's where a forensic pathologist would look for the three classic indicators of manual strangulation: a fractured hyoid bone, hemorrhaging in the strap muscles of the throat, and petechiae, the tiny pinpoint hemorrhages that appear when blood vessels rupture under sustained pressure. None of those signs can be evaluated from the back of the neck, which is mostly muscle and spine, and which is the only region Dr. Mitchell was able to examine. Whether that tissue was withheld because it showed nothing, or because it showed something the first autopsy documented and hasn't yet released to the public, is a question only the state's original report can answer. And as of this recording, that report still has not been made public. Dr. Melinek's third point is one that trips up almost everyone unfamiliar with forensic science: toxicology, and specifically alcohol. After death, as a body decomposes, naturally occurring bacteria can produce alcohol on their own, entirely separate from anything the person drank while alive. In a body that spent days exposed before a full examination, that internally generated alcohol can push a toxicology reading well past a level that looks intoxicating, without a single drink ever being involved. Readings from a heavily decomposed body have been documented climbing to levels many times higher than what would be considered legally impaired in a living person, purely from bacterial activity. That means any toxicology number connected to this case has to be read in the context of exactly how advanced decomposition was at the time each sample was drawn, not taken as a flat, standalone fact. The first state autopsy, conducted closer to the time of recovery, would carry more reliable toxicology than any sample pulled later in the process. And notably, the independent autopsy performed by Dr. Mitchell did not include a toxicology report at all. That data, if it exists, remains inside the state's still unreleased findings. Put together, Dr. Melinek's breakdown doesn't accuse anyone of anything. It does something more disruptive to a case that's already been publicly characterized as an accident. It explains, in plain terms, why nobody outside the medical examiner's office is currently in a position to say that with confidence. Forensic evidence isn't the only reason this case has drawn national attention. Nolan Wells was black. Ocean Springs is a majority white, middle to upper class community. The friends he was with on Horn Island, by most public accounts, were largely white, with at least one other black friend also on the trip. Given Mississippi's documented history of racial violence, some in the national conversation, including the NAP, which passed a formal resolution urging law enforcement to handle the case with full transparency, have raised the question of whether race shaped how quickly and how carefully this investigation moved in its earliest days. It's important to be precise about what has and hasn't been established here. No evidence made public to date proves that Nolan's death involved another person at all, let alone that race played any role in what happened to him. The family's attorney has been careful, in every public statement, not to allege a specific crime or a specific suspect. What the family and the Naintas case have criticized is not a named individual. It's a process, an early public tone of reassurance, a still unreleased state autopsy, and a piece of evidence that hasn't been handed over. Those are fair questions to ask about any investigation, regardless of who's involved. Whether race shaped how this one unfolded is something only a fuller accounting of the investigation's internal decisions could actually answer, and that accounting doesn't exist publicly yet either. As it stands, here is what is confirmed and what is not. Confirmed: Nolan Wells, 18 years old, disappeared from Horn Island on July 4th after his friend's boat began taking on water. His body was recovered 2 days later. A state autopsy was performed July 7th. Its full findings remain unreleased. An independent autopsy, performed July 10th by Dr. Roger Mitchell, returned a preliminary finding of undetermined cause and manner of death, noted unexplained discoloration at the back of the head, and was conducted without access to the front of the neck or a completed toxicology report. Not confirmed any specific cause of death, any suspect, any allegation that a specific person caused Nolan's death, any confirmed connection between the case and race, one way or the other. What would move this case from unfinished to actually resolved isn't speculation, it's three specific things. The original state autopsy report, which could explain both the cause of death and the reasoning behind retaining the neck tissue in the first place. Access to that retained tissue itself, which still exists and could still be examined by an independent expert if released. And a complete toxicology report, properly interpreted against the level of decomposition present at the time it was drawn. None of that requires new evidence to be created. It requires evidence that already exists to be handed over. Nobody in this case has been charged with a crime. The independent finding remains undetermined. Nothing in this video claims otherwise, and nothing Dr. Melinek said in her breakdown claims otherwise either. What is true is simpler, and in some ways more uncomfortable. A conclusion was offered to the public before the science was in any position to support one. And weeks later, the single piece of physical evidence that could most directly answer the biggest open question in this case, was there any sign of pressure to the front of Nolan Wells' neck, is still sitting in an evidence room instead of in a completed report anyone outside that office has read. Christine Wansley has asked, more than once, for exactly one thing, the truth, whatever it turns out to be, not a name, not a verdict handed down before it's earned, just an answer her family can actually stand behind. We don't have that answer yet, but we know exactly what it will take to get there, and when the state autopsy is finally released, we'll be back to walk through it, line by line, without spin and without waiting for someone else to explain it first. If you want to be here for that moment, instead of hearing about it secondhand, subscribe and turn on notifications. This case isn't closed. It's unfinished, and we'll be here when the next piece drops.